Welcome to the Triathlon Nutrition Academy podcast, the show designed to serve you up evidence-based sports nutrition advice from the experts. Hi, I'm your host Taryn, accredited practicing dietitian, advanced sports dietitian, and founder of Dietitian Approved. Listen as I break down the latest evidence to give you practical, easy to digest strategies to train hard, recover faster, and perform at your best. You have so much potential, and I want to help you unlock that with the power of nutrition. Let's get into it. On today's episode of the podcast, I'm joined by physiologist Avish Sharma. He has done his PhD in altitude training at the Uni of Canberra and the Australian Institute of Sport. I had the pleasure of working with Avish in my role at Triathlon Australia and as part of data collection for some of the race walker studies down at the AIS in Canberra. He took a lead role heading into the Tokyo Olympics for the triathlon team. He did a lot of work getting them heat acclimatized and heat adapted for what was set to be a really hot environment. So he's perfect to join us on the podcast today to talk about heat acclimation and how to do it properly. He's moved on from Triathlon Australia days and is currently working with the athletics program down at the Victorian Institute of Sport. He's always a good chat. Avish loves a good laksa, and I hope you enjoy the conversation today. All right, welcome to the podcast, Avish.
Hello, Taz. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
That's good.
I miss working with you at Triathlon Australia. Those were good times, weren't they?
You were the first kind of fun dietitian that I worked with. Actually, no, that's not true. I've worked with a lot of great dietitians, but I feel like we connected early on. Was it Supernova 1, I think, with the race walkers? Maybe you came down for a little bit.
Yep, that's right. I helped with a race walker study. It's because you're an awesome human and we, bonded over laksa.
Yes, that is one of many noodles that I enjoy eating.
So I wanted to get you on the podcast today, Avish, because you are the master in physiology for heat adaptation and you had some pretty good practice in the Olympics heading into Tokyo with our triathlon team. But I wanted to give the age group triathletes listening some tips for racing in the heat, because in Australia, our age group season is very much in the hot part of the year. And even Cairns Ironman, which is in the middle of winter, it's June for us, is still always a really, really hot race. And then this year we've got Kona back on the timetable too, which is in October, and that race is spicy hot. So I'd love to get people to start thinking ahead to prepare what they're going to do for racing in the heat and also their training leading up to stuff, because it is a completely different kettle of fish compared to more of a cooler, temperate environment. Before we get too deep into it, I do want people to go and listen to my 7 tips for exercising in the heat episode if you haven't listened to it already. It's episode number 16. It's got some really good nutritional tips for what to do if you're trying to train in the heat. But I've got Avish on today to go a bit deeper into, how we heat adapt and the benefits of doing it. So that is why you're here, mate.
I'll do my best and give your listeners some practical advice and things that they can use in their own prep to help them race as fast as possible in some of their races coming up.
Thank you. That is exactly what this podcast is about, translating that deep science into something that's practical, easy to understand, that anyone can walk away with. So thank you.
No dramas.
All right, let's get into it. Why, firstly, would someone even want to heat adapt themselves?
So usually when you exercise, most of the blood that's flowing in your body is directed to your working muscles. But when you exercise in the heat, exercising normally unadapted will cause you to produce more heat than usual and faster. And so that can become quite detrimental to performance. And so one of the ways your body compensates initially is by directing more blood flow to your skin so you can dissipate off more heat. But then as a flow-on consequence by that affects your exercise performance. So basically one of the reasons you heat adapt is to facilitate that process. And then over time, as your body adapts, physiological processes will occur and then more blood flow will be directed to your muscle. And there'll be another series of adaptations such as reduced heart rate, skin blood flow to help you dissipate heat better, sweat rates, things like that, that'll help you thermoregulate better in the heat and preserve your exercise performance. So hopefully that's a simplistic reason why you should heat adapt. And there are several different protocols anyone from an everyday athlete to professional athletes can use to prepare themselves for such things. Also, there's actually quite a bit of research coming out now around doing heat training just to get fitter, not necessarily to prepare for exercise in the heat, because a lot of the adaptations that occur through heat training are kind of similar to endurance training in terms of the same pathways that occur, which we don't really have to get into. But one of the ways we use heat training is to just add an extra stress into training for a variety of reasons. So, yeah.
So heat adaptation is trying to get your body to exercise better in a hot environment. So it does all of these things to help your body cool itself down and make sure you still survive that process and don't die. Is there particular types of people or even perhaps different distances of triathlon that it would be better for?
So for the listeners, I worked a bit with the Australian triathlon team in the lead up to Tokyo. And so given that most of the athletes on the team had two events, the relay and the individual, in a hypothetical world, even if we had athletes just preparing for a 20-minute relay event, it would still be relevant for them to do some sort of heat preparation in the lead up to that event. Definitely for, even a sprint distance and Olympic distance. And then as the duration gets longer, it becomes even more relevant still. So, half Ironman distance. I mean, it's a very individual thing who's susceptible to the heat, but thinking about other sports that are kind of outdoors, you're probably looking at like 5 to 10 minute duration and up to do some level of heat preparation. But then, for the shorter heat events, it's probably more about like your thermal perception, because even just feeling hot, if nothing is actually happening internally, like that'll send signals to your brain to kind of slow down. Whereas as the duration of the event gets longer, your core temperature actually will be rising. So it becomes relevant to put things into place to sort of help with that. So yeah, I would say if you're in that shorter range, 5 to 20 minutes or 30 minutes, like it's probably more about your thermal perception that you need to find strategies to feel cool, because your core temperature won't get so high within that short time frame to actually be that detrimental. But if once you get longer than that, you probably need to start more traditional kind of heat prep and cooling strategies to actually like lower your core temperature either before the event or mitigate the rise in core temp during event to sort of help you perform a little bit.
So some of those cooling strategies that you're alluding to would be, ice slushy ingestion to do some internal cooling, some external cooling like jumping in an ice bath, menthol, there's some research in that. Is there any other cooling strategies that I've missed?
No, not really. We can get into this now around our cooling strategies that we used in Tokyo. It was a pretty mixed method, sort of a combination of internal cooling strategies, i.e. like consuming something that will make you cold from the inside, external cooling strategies, so applying things onto you like an ice bath, a cold shower, ice vest, towels, fans, all sorts of things like that. So we sort of took a combined approach to kind of get double the effect, I guess. But also I think the main thing that we did was a lot of rehearsal, a lot of, athlete choice in what they did. Like, some athletes don't like having a high volume of fluid before they race, so they focus more on their external cooling, vice versa. I mean, no lean triathlete loves sitting in an ice bath for that long because you can get really, really cold. So we sort of, through trial and error, found a water temperature that sort of worked for us, but still had the physiological benefits, and then practice with varying lengths of immersion and things like that pre-race, and got people to do, a full warmer practice so they'd be really comfortable doing it by the time we got to the Olympics and Paralympics.
Did I see Emma Jeffcoat wearing an ice vest thing on the bike in her race?
No, I don't think so, but a lot of them would have warmed up with either an ice vest in some cases, or even just towels around their neck, under their armpits and things like that. So a lot of athletes, especially on stationary bikes, would have had some sort of external cooling, and combining that with either sipping on a slushie or having it more in like bolus form. So like a large quantity at once rather than sort of sipping it over time. But we can get into sort of the specifics of some of that later in the conversation if you like, Taz.
Yeah, maybe I saw an image of her in her warm-up with it on. That could have been what it was. Interesting to kind of not be there for once, but then kind of see all the stuff that was happening from the perspective of kind of knowing roughly what was going on. Yeah, it's hard to sit in the sidelines in Australia, actually. Okay, so in terms of heat adaptation, we're trying to get the body to perform better in a hot environment, and we can help that process by doing heat adaptation strategies plus some cooling strategies. Is there any negatives and any particular people that need to potentially not play with this sort of stuff?
Yeah, so like on the gender differences, I think that research is still emerging. So I don't think it's set enough yet that you'd be fully comfortable making an evidence-based recommendation of it. I think the main thing that we were concerned about with the heat training is just like how much it takes out of you in a sport that's already pretty high volume. The elite athletes in the Olympic team and their colleagues that are representing Australia, they're training, 25 to 35 hours a week as a guide. It's already a lot of physiological and physical stress on the body. And then you're adding in something else again, which in athletes that already find it hard to recover, pretty much do most of their sessions with non-optimal fueling because it's physically impossible to get enough food in the hours in the day to fuel that many sessions. So anytime you add something on top of that, really, like, without getting too kind of population specific here between different people, like, that's going to impair their ability to recover again. So it was something that we grappled with quite a lot because we couldn't compromise the normal physical and physiological preparation of the athletes just to get heat training in. So that's probably something that's important to remember for the listeners. It's definitely important to integrate some sort of heat preparation for, Cairns or Kona or whatever race it is in the heat that you're preparing for, but don't do it such that it compromises your normal training. Because at the end of the day, the best thing you can do to perform well in the heat is be really fit in general. And then on top of that, add in some of these strategies that can give you that extra 1% to 5% improvement as well. I probably don't have an answer in terms of, which specific groups might be more susceptible, but the main thing to look out for is in an already high volume sport, adding on an extra stress that can make people more susceptible to low energy availability and more susceptible to under recovery and under fueling and all these other things that can be red flags to having a good performance.
That's an excellent point. Thank you. Because I know that people listening will be like, yep, I'm definitely going to do this. Triathletes like shiny objects and like to be across all the things. So just a little, stop point or checkpoint in your thinking that if you haven't got all of that nutritional side of stuff optimized, you haven't got your nutrition periodized, your energy availability is on the sketchy side of things, then you don't play with something like this. This is when you've got all the other stuff dialed in. The sprinkles on the icing on the cake, right? It's the little top tier things that we can utilize when you've got that really solid cake foundation made first.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even within the modalities of heat preparation and cooling that you do, there are some that are probably like lesser impact than others and more practically achievable.
What would they be?
Even in preparation for Tokyo, it was sort of like the COVID games, as everyone knows. So a lot of the athletes, as the listeners would know, are sort of spread around Australia, if not spread around the world in the lead up to a major competition. So we were buying, Bunnings tents and setting up heaters inside those, spas and saunas, post sessions, extra clothing, indoors without a fan, which is kind of an interesting one because the two things you want when you're adapting to the heat is an increase in core temperature and you want to sweat heaps. But the thing with the sweat response is you kind of want to facilitate it to evaporate because when it evaporates, you sweat more. Whereas if you sweat and it kind of just pools on your skin, it sort of dampens the sweat response. So quite often people exercising to prepare for the heat won't exercise with a fan. And so what I would say is like, that's fine at the start to get hot quicker. But at a certain point, ideally you want to promote airflow and promote evaporation of sweat off the skin to promote that sweat response as much as you can. Even though, we had access to things like testing in the lab and sort of measuring heat responses in a bit more detail, a lot of the techniques we used were pretty simple. Like some of the athletes, literally I had them, either I went to Bunnings and bought a tent or had them go to Bunnings and bought a tent, set it up in a garage and had multiple gas and, radiant heaters and things like that going. So it was pretty rudimentary a lot of the time. But yeah, you don't need much to build a bit of a home setup and you can do it for less than $200 really.
So is something like a sauna then not effective because you're getting that heat, but then you don't have the evaporation of that sweat?
I wouldn't say that. It's like all of this stuff, as soon as you start increasing core temperature and producing sweat, they're going to be effective to a degree, right? I wouldn't go and say it's not effective, but because we use kind of like a mixed methods thing and sort of had to fit it in around people that are training sort of 30 hours a week or whatever, it's kind of like finding the most appropriate stimulus at a given time. So sometimes that would involve exercising in a heat chamber. Sometimes it would involve sitting in a spa or a sauna, et cetera, et cetera. So as long as, you're kind of hitting most of those things at some point in a periodized way, like I think it's fine. Like some athletes, all they'll have access to is a spa. So I wouldn't not recommend they use that because they're going to be immersed the whole time and don't get as much evaporation as, other modalities of heat, but they're still getting the core temperature increase really. So the first barrier to a lot of the listeners will be what can you actually access that's practical and you can achieve in a timely manner, and then layering on some of the need to haves versus the nice to haves on top of that to get what works for you.
How do you actually heat adapt yourself then? Like we've talked about lots of different options and lots of different methods, but what is the protocol? Like how long does it take? What do you actually need to do to know that you've done some heat adaptation?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the timeframes, like kind of depends. So a lot of the research has kind of been obviously in lab settings to measure responses and things like that. And it's kind of been broken down into short, medium, and long-term heat adaptation or heat acclimation. And so if you're doing consecutive days of heat stress, which again, we'll get to the fact that that's not necessarily practical for everyone, but just as a starting point, if you're doing consecutive days, you'll start getting a reasonable amount of adaptation within 5 days. So some of the first adaptations that you'll get are kind of like a stabilization in heart rate. So for the same intensity of exercise, your heart rate progressively will get less each day until it sort of reaches point of maximal adaptation after about a week. Your plasma volume, which is sort of a component of your blood, will expand within the first week as well. And there are a couple of other things like that. However, the sweat response, i.e. to help you sweat a little bit more in the heat, to dissipate more heat when you're exercising the heat, that probably takes more in the 10 days to 2 weeks range. So the simple answer is most of the adaptations you can get within a week to 2 weeks, and you'll have pretty much all adaptations in 2 weeks to a little bit over 2 weeks. So that's if you do consecutive days of heat training, which in terms of in the Tokyo prep, how we approached it was in order to get those full range of adaptations, working with the coaches, we sort of came up with a period in the season, whether it was, straight after a race or where it could fit in with training, where we did try and chase those consecutive days of heat stress. Obviously, probably not so much right in the lead up to the event, with the exception of like being in a hot environment in the lead up to the event. So you sort of obviously get some incidental heat stress there. But in terms of an actual intervention using chambers, spas, saunas and stuff, we're sort of talking more doing some of the work early. So, 2, 3, 4 months out from the major event that we were preparing for, going after like a real block of consecutive days training there. So, a couple of the athletes went with that approach, probably around Easter time, like April-ish. We're able to get either, 10 days heat done in 12 days or, 9 days straight or things like that. Like in this time when you're sort of competing with regular competition and other priorities in training, you kind of like take what you can get. So that was that. But then probably what's going to be more common for people is kind of intermittent approach. So maybe 2 days a week or 3 days a week. But obviously, given you're not having the consecutive nature of that, you sort of have to do it for a longer period. But fortunately, there have been some pretty good studies showing 3 sessions a week for 3 to 4 weeks and have some pretty good results in terms of some of the adaptations we talked about before. So there was a study in New Zealand in some, highly trained runners that showed they did, I think, 3 sauna sessions a week for 4 weeks. And what that entailed was 60 minutes of low intensity exercise before, so just running. And then immediately after the session, sort of sitting in a sauna for 30 minutes. So what's that? 12 sessions, and they showed good improvements in exercise performance. I think it was measured with a treadmill test or something like that, and some changes in plasma volume as well. So something like that is pretty practically achievable for most people. I mean, a lot of gyms have saunas these days, or if not a sauna, a spa at your local swimming pool. So that's something that is quite a good option for a lot of people.
So the slow track would be maybe 3 sessions a week over a month, say, and you still have the same adaptations as 9 days in a row, 10 days in a row.
I mean, everyone's individual. Like some people will get a faster response than others. So whether or not you'll actually get the exact same adaptation. But to be honest, it's not really what we're here for. It's kind of just doing whatever you need to prepare for your event that you can manage. And even with some of the athletes, like it's all very, very periodized. Like there'd be some times where just to get a bit of a stimulus in, like we've started the athletes with 1 session a week in the chamber, like 1 90-minute bike ride in the chamber. And then that'll progress into 2 once they kind of got into it, and then 3. With some of these environmental stresses, as Taryn mentioned at the top, like my background's in altitude training, and sort of a lot of the way you think about heat and altitude can be quite similar. And there's a lot of research in the altitude literature around a cumulative effect over a long period of time. So like with repeat exposures. And we sort of had a similar philosophy with the heat stuff for Tokyo, is that some of the athletes, they're, from places like Victoria or Tasmania or, Southern Australia, where peak temperatures in the summer are only in the mid to high 20s a lot of the time, as compared to, northern New South Wales or Queensland, where it's a lot hotter. So, logic would dictate that they probably need a bit more kind of heat work to sort of get ready for something like Tokyo. But then you have to balance that out about how tired heat training can make you and how some of the detriments of it. So we sort of almost try to take a bit of a long-term approach in that it's not just sort of getting some heat work done in the 6 weeks before an Olympics or Paralympics. It's more about starting the conversation, 2 years out or 18 months out and saying like, when can we get regular doses of just a little bit just to top up the system and stress the body to make new adaptations that it hasn't necessarily had before. And to try simplify it, it kind of makes sense in an intuitive way, right? Like if you spend a lot of time in hot conditions or hot weather, you're probably going to deal with it more so than, someone that's come from the snow or something like that.
Yeah, totally. The people that live in Queensland and train in Queensland and then race in the heats, it's just normal for us. It's crazy hot. Like we've just had a really crazy heat wave go through northern Queensland. But then it's more so for the people that travel up from, say, Melbourne and do Cairns Ironman in June, which is spicy hot and really struggle. So it's those sorts of people that need to start thinking about it early and often and building that into their training. But I love that you said, start as far away as possible because it is really going to stress the body and you need to make sure that you can still recover from that. Otherwise, there's no point adding that into your periodization if it's just going to smash you.
One of the athletes that I worked with and you would have worked with as well, Taryn, like she earlier in her career had quite a few negative experiences in the heat, some races that she couldn't finish because of how hot it was. And she just took like a really long-term methodical approach of probably 2 or 3 times a year doing 2 or 3 week blocks of just getting in the heat chamber, and her coach would write her sessions and she'd get them done down at the sports institute that she was working with. And sort of that culminated in a world championship medal in quite a hot race. The body is very malleable in terms of adaptations, right? If you expose it to a stressor often enough and regularly, like you'll get a response in time.
Yeah, it's really good advice. Thank you, Avish. So if somebody is heat acclimatized, how long do those adaptations last for?
So there's been some reasonably cool research done on that, and it was quite influential for us, people like myself that are kind of coming up with these plans for athletes to get them ready for an Olympics and Paralympics. So there's some research out there that kind of showed that if we had people that were fully heat adapted, i.e., their heart rate for a certain intensity had stabilized again, they were sweating a lot more, plasma volume has expanded and all that.
Which you can test for in the lab. An age grouper can't do that sort of thing, but yes.
To be honest though, like I think one of the questions earlier was like, how can we kind of, know that it's actually working? And something simple like, on day one of your heat session, if you want to just jump in, like do something like ride really easy, but keep it fixed for like 20 minutes and just measure your heart rate and like write down out of 10 how hard it is. And then after your sessions, repeat the exact same thing. Like you should see a change. If you haven't seen a change there, like that means that you probably haven't quite got it right. And maybe you can, get some help from a physiologist or a dietitian about, what are the things that I'm doing that might not be optimal here. So I think the main message here is you don't always need the shiniest lab facilities and things like that to actually measure what you're doing. I think simple tools that are readily available, I'd always recommend using that. But anyway, in terms of on the decay, so someone that's fully heat adapted, you sort of need to maintain the stimulus every kind of 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the individual. So if someone's gone and done their, 7 days in a row of heat prep, but then they do nothing for kind of like 6 weeks, you'll essentially probably have to start from zero again. Whereas if you sort of do what's called like a top-up session, so you don't have to do a full 7 days again, I think as long as it was within, that sort of 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the individual, they retained a lot of the adaptations they got the first time. So then you need to do less sessions to get back up to 100%. So that was kind of how we did it, was kind of, a longer block, kind of 3 to 4 months out, and then some maintenance. We spent a bit of time in Cairns, a couple of months out from the Olympics and Paralympics as well. And then the final lead up was really just, 1 or 2 sessions a week. And then by virtue of COVID, we had to be in Tokyo sort of like, 5 or 6 days before the event anyway. So then there's your natural heat stress there. So hopefully that sort of paints a picture to the listeners of like a combination of different approaches over different times, with sort of ideally no more than like kind of a month in between exposures to help retain that stimulus and adaptation in the body.
Some really good advice there for different ways that you can do it. There's no one fixed approach. But like you said earlier, it's got to be either, a week or 2 every day, back to back, or building up to 3 days a week over 3 to 4 weeks to try and get that same performance enhancements that we get from the solid block together.
For the listeners and the age group triathletes, like I'd probably honestly start with what can you achieve that fits in with your training commitment, with your lifestyle overall, et cetera, et cetera. Like I've had athletes in the past, not in triathlon, but in other sports, doing 10 weeks straight of heat prep, but only 1 or 2 sessions a week because that's what worked in with all their other goals kind of thing. So it's sort of like if you can only manage a lesser amount of sessions weekly, just do it for a longer period of time. But if you can actually say, oh, actually, I can do probably 5 sessions this week, well, then you probably only need to do 1 or 2 weeks of that.
Or if you live in Queensland, it's just every day. So it's all good.
Well, it was funny on that because I think we got to a point that, I was definitely recommending for the Queensland-based athletes to kind of almost get out of Queensland for a month in summer just to train in some cooler weather and actually be able to kind of,
hit some targets.
Yeah, exactly. So it's almost like reverse heat training and just, training quality and things like that become quite difficult at a time when you're getting these, oppressive heat waves and it's just so humid all the time in Queensland. So yeah, it's all about balance and getting everything you need really.
So if somebody lives in a cool environment but then has to travel for a hot race, do you have any advice for them to try and maximize their heat adaptation heading in?
Yeah, like I'd probably start at the event and work backwards, right? So the first step would be like, well, how long can you be in the venue before the actual race? Like, if there's some people that can be in Kona for 2 weeks before the actual event, that lessens the amount that they need to do in the lead up because they're going to get a hell of a lot of adaptation from being there and doing their final preparation, like in those conditions. Even in that, one of the things that we sort of had to consider was for athletes that hadn't done heat in a long time. And then, in our case, putting them in Cairns for 3 weeks, you almost have to prepare them for that itself. Even those athletes still did a little bit of heat prep just to get that adaptive stimulus going and sort of get the body used to some of those things. Because the last thing you want is to be able to go to a training camp and then you're so cooked all the time that you can't actually train properly and things like that. So it's a similar thing here with Kona, I think. Like for me, regardless of how much time you can spend there before the race, whether it's, 3 days or 14 days, I'd probably still advocate for doing some sort of prep throughout the Australian winter, just because the more you get used to it, like the less of an impact it will have at the time. Whereas if you're doing heat prep for the first time ever, like less than 3 weeks out from the race, like it's going to knock you around a fair bit. So it's almost like getting that really unfriendly period out of the way early so then you can actually focus on your training. That was probably like the main philosophy we took with our heat preparation with the Olympic and Paralympic triathletes was that the discussion with the coaches was like, all right, what are the key periods of training that you don't want like any interruptions in and you want them to be going really well? And sort of once you find out those ones, then it's like, okay, well, you can't do any heat training there really unless you're in a warmish environment. So Cairns in winter is not too bad. It kind of gets up to high 20s, low 30s, which is manageable. It's not oppressive like it was in Japan. So the training quality still, you're able to still get a fair bit done. But we kind of looked at other periods that would be more suitable to really like kind of give the athletes a stress and we could build in more recovery and things like that. So where volume and intensity weren't really so much of a priority. And then being able to manage that with recovery as well, sort of thing. So it's a puzzle, but it doesn't need to be an overly complex puzzle. It's just kind of like still listen to your body, still, support yourself well with adequate nutrition and sleep and things like that. But yeah, it's just about sort of periodizing it in when it'll work.
People hear me say the word periodized all the time, so I'm glad that you're saying it too. One of the things that is useful with triathlon is you do a bit of pre-cooling by jumping in for the swim, right? You get into a colder temperature than is your body temperature, so you can do a bit of pre-cooling that way. But what about for swimming in environments where the water is not actually cool? You get in and it's a bit of a bath.
Yes, that was probably one of the most unique challenges about Tokyo and something that we found interesting to work through. So, intuitively you'd be like, well, if it's hot outside, you'll sort of do heat training with the heater and on a bike or running. So logic might follow that, oh, well, the water's going to be warm. Let's just do a ton of swimming in hot pools or learn to swim pools or swimming with a wetsuit.
Not nice.
Actually, the physiological evidence for it isn't actually that strong. Whereas 14 days of heat training or sitting in a sauna and all that stuff like works. And there's quite a lot of evidence for it. The studies that have shown a similar approach for swimming in, water temperatures in the low 30s, which is, gets quite oppressive. The adaptations aren't as good. However, what you probably do need to do and what we sort of tried to work on was sort of, it's still going to feel terrible when you jump into the ocean or river or whatever it is, and it's like 32 degrees or 31 degrees or whatever. So what I would suggest is kind of working on the perceptual side. So it becomes really familiar to you. So that way you can get your brain used to it and kind of still push when you need to. So we had our athletes at various times, again, in a periodized way, completing some of their sessions in, learn to swim pools or with a wetsuit on. If we were fortunate enough to have like natural hot water, we would seek that out. So just to get that kind of almost that mental adaptation to, okay, this is what it's going to be like. The first time you want to be swimming in 31-degree water is not the race. Like try and sort of set yourself up to experience that beforehand. People seem to be really attuned to like really small changes in water temp, and like the difference between, 27.5 and 28.5 is a lot different to the same difference in air temperature kind of thing. So, even if you can get to like a 30-degree pool, it might not be exactly the same as what you're going to be swimming in a race, but something is better than nothing kind of thing. So, I think some of our athletes probably did in the couple of months leading up, maybe like 5 or 6 swims in really uncomfortable water just to sort of get used to the whole notion.
Do you want to talk a bit more about pre-cooling, like any specifics around what people could potentially do in that space at home, like slushies, ice vests, that sort of stuff? Like say somebody racing Cairns or racing Kona, or even just our, short course race schedule in really hot environments. What sort of things could people practically do in that sense to keep their internal core temperature down?
So I guess the most basic one is slushies, and it's pretty easy. I'm sure you've got a killer slushie recipe, Taryn, but the one we used was sort of like 2 parts ice, 1 part water, 1 scoop of whatever electrolyte sports drink powder. You're sort of chuck that all into a NutriBullet, give it a bit of a blitz, and that's the makings of a pretty basic slushie. Because Tokyo was so oppressive, we were adding things like glycerol or extra sodium into the slushies as well. Again, to the athlete's taste, with a variety of different sports drink that worked for them, and sort of came up with kind of a formula that sort of worked for each individual. So, some athletes loved having a Red Bull before the race, so we'd make them a Red Bull slushie. Others, were pretty comfortable with whatever brand of sports drink that they were used to, so we'd make it out of that. So we had a pretty kind of bespoke way with our slushies, which I think worked quite well, and people were quite practiced with it. The thing that probably takes a little bit of getting used to with slushie is kind of the manner in which you drink it. So the base recommendations from the literature are kind of like 7 grams or mils per kilo of your body weight. So if you're, a 60 kilo person, that's roughly 400 mils of slushie that you want to be consuming. And I think to really get that drop in core temperature, you sort of want to consume a lot quickly. What we would get our athletes to work towards is kind of like generally pre-race for most of the athletes was centered around their swim warm-up, which takes place at a fixed time. You always have to be out sort of, 30 minutes before or whatever it is before the race. And so we kind of put that in first and then scheduled around that. And so what we generally advocated was kind of try and drink half in one go right before you swim warm-up, and then half somewhere in between finishing your last bit of exercise and then the race start sort of thing. So that's something you definitely need to work towards to get the maximal effect kind of thing, and just ingesting that much at a given time.
Is there any tips on how to get that in quickly without getting a massive brain freeze?
No, I'm literally just sort of try and not swill it around in your mouth for too long, just sort of just get it down. And we use spoons and straws and things like that. So even though you're sort of taking in a lot over time, you're not sort of taking massive gulps. It's sort of like lots of small gulps kind of thing, if that kind of makes sense. So that's probably the main one with the slushies. Ice vests are pretty self-explanatory, to be honest. But ice vests aren't the most accessible things, but something that we used with varying degrees of success, but it sort of depends on how you use them, is kind of ice towels. And it's as simple as it kind of sounds. Get a towel, fill it with ice or dunk it in ice water, wring it out and sort of keep it around your neck, armpits, sort of those sorts of areas between your legs.
For the regular listener, that's where a lot of blood flow is in those areas. So it's going to go right centrally. If you can put it under your armpits, in your groin, there's big blood vessels in there that'll take that back to the heart.
Absolutely. So that probably works best if you've got time pre-race to kind of just sit and relax. It doesn't work so well if you're trying to have an ice towel around your neck when you're walking around or still exercising or things like that. So yeah, if you've got periods of time where you can just sit and relax, that's a good one. It's relatively easy to do on the fly with just a couple of towels that you've got from your hotel or your race pack or whatever. And hopefully there'll be plenty of hotel ice machines or something like that you can, get a bit of ice from. Even with slushie, if you don't have a blender handy, freezing a Powerade or whatever drink of choice overnight and just smashing it up the morning of and consuming the ice. The key thing with the slushie is that because the heat transfer from ice when it changes to liquid is a lot better than just having a cold liquid. It does make a difference having an icy drink rather than just super cold liquid. Cold liquid will still help if that's all you can do. But yeah, the key really is to sort of get that kind of ice slurry, and then, ice baths and things like that. Anything below probably, 21 degrees, 20 degrees is quite uncomfortable most of the time. But if you have a bit of time, you can, have a progressively graded cold shower, gradually drop the temperature here and there. Plenty of little options there for people to kind of have a play around with and find what works with them. But really, what you sort of want is kind of to get a bit of a drop in core temperature before the race. So it almost gives you a bit more room. The difficult thing in triathlon is the front end of the swim is essentially a sprint, like it's full intensity. So you sort of want to have a colder core temperature, but you don't want to compromise muscle temperature whatsoever. So as we got closer to race start, the internal cooling techniques kind of took over as the dominant ones, whereas like pre-warm up, sort of an hour to 2 hours before, we'd sort of have the ice bath and things like that if athletes wanted to use them. But then they'd sort of still have time through the warm up to sort of get back up to regular muscle temperatures and things like that. Whereas in other sports, it's a bit more of a graded intensity start at the beginning of a race. So having really high muscle temperatures probably isn't as critical as it is in triathlon. So the message here is you don't want to cool down so much when you're preparing for a triathlon just because of the nature of the swim. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Or for the short course racing, like sprint and Olympic, where you want to sort of go guns blazing at the start, compared to, say, a bit more like 70.3 Ironman distance where you're warming up as you go because you're out there for so long. Different strategy for those sort of different distances. Could you have a slushie on the bike in your bottle if you can get it to stay that slushie consistency? That's the challenge.
In a word, yes, but the main challenge there is the actual logistics of getting it done. A lot of the athletes sort of froze water bottles or drink bottles overnight because a lot of the time at ITU racing or World Triathlon or whatever it's called now, you sort of have to rack your bottles predetermined time before. I'm assuming it's the same in age group racing. So if you're racking your bottles 2 hours before, within that 2 hours, they'll probably melt a little bit so you can get a nice little consistency there. And that seems to work quite well in hot races. We definitely, invested a little bit in some insulated bottles, which are all commercially available for anyone who's interested. Those seem to work reasonably well as well in terms of keeping the fluid, whatever was inside, like reasonably cold.
It's something you could test out beforehand. Like if you know roughly what time it is between transition closing and when your wave start is, estimate when you'll then be on the bike. Freeze your bottles overnight in like Camelback do them, those insulated bottles, but there's other brands as well. And leave it out from that time and see what happens to it and see if it is still cool or if it's frozen in a brick. You don't want to get onto the bike and have your water or fluids or whatever completely frozen, not consumable. But then, you're not getting any benefit, I guess, if it's completely melted too. But, you still need your liquid on the bike. So you can actually test that in a training situation and see what happens to it.
Absolutely.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining me, Avish. So many awesome practical things that people can walk away with. Little bit of a word of caution, though, is that you wouldn't really dabble with stuff like this unless you've got everything else nailed first. You've got a really good training program and you're absorbing your training. You're not just absolutely smashed at the end of the training week. And also that you've got your nutrition periodized to that. You know how to eat for light days. You know how to eat for moderate days. You know how to eat for hard days. Because if you layer in these more performance enhancing strategies, your body needs to actually absorb them to get better. If you're not absorbing that, then you aren't really getting that benefit, are you? You're just smashing yourself and putting yourself into more of a hole, which is not ideal either.
I completely agree with all of that. And the good thing is that there are some, less invasive and less potentially risky strategies. So, a starting point might literally be, instead of doing your run early in the morning, maybe try and fit it in your lunch hour instead in the middle of the day. Like that could literally be step one, just to get a little bit of extra heat stress there. And doing that consistently over a month, that will already have an effect. It's helpful to think about, what little things that I can do that won't, cause that much of a threat to my overall training as a starting point. And then, if you're handling all that really well and you find like you're progressing, then you can maybe add something in like a spa or a sauna or whatever. And if that again goes well, and then maybe you can, buy an extra couple of heaters and chuck them in your laundry and sort of go there as well. So plenty of different ways to sort of approach the problem. But whilst the heat training is an important aspect of preparing for competition in the heat, like it's not going to replace being fit in the first place and healthy and sort of having a good balance between all your training and everything else.
Yeah, good advice. So if people want to hear more from you, Avish, where do they find you?
I'm on Twitter. I think it's Avish Sharma 5. I mostly sort of tweet about sort of work-related stuff and publications and things like that. But if people want to get in touch, I think they can sort of probably send me a message on that kind of thing, or just follow what I'm interested in.
Yeah, I might link a few papers in the show notes too if people do want to read a little bit further about heat adaptation and how to do it, and some pre-cooling stuff too. There's a few people that do want to read a little bit deeper. So I'll put some of those in the show notes too.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Avish. Have a great day.
And you. See ya.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Triathlon Nutrition Academy podcast. I would love to hear from you. If you have any questions or want to share with me what you've learnt, email me at podcast@dietitianapproved.com. You can also spread the word by leaving me a review and taking a screenshot of you listening to the show. Don't forget to tag me on social media at dietitian.approved so I can give you a shout out too. If you want to learn more about what we do, head to dietitianapproved.com. And if you want to learn more about the Triathlon Nutrition Academy program, head to dietitianapproved.com/academy. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to helping you smash it in the fourth leg. Nutrition!